Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ron Sieber, and I'm very pleased to be the opening host for this afternoon's Kaplan Family Distinguished Lecture in Public Service. I want to first say a few words about public service and public engagement at Cornell. This has been a very good year for our university in many, many ways. The Public Service Center is enjoying its 20th anniversary this year, and in its traditional engaging fashion has run approximately 7,000 of our students through one or more public service ventures this year. And if you think about that, over 50% of a very busy student body have managed to find the Public Service Center, engage themselves in everything from volunteer to co-curricular to curricular activities, and to be out there in the world in a way that is important both to us, reflects a national trend that affects education and really reflects student demand as well. A second aspect of that is that over 100 faculty have been engaged with the Public Service Center in running courses which have a field component and a service component associated with them, and which sometimes are curricular and sometimes distinctly co-curricular in nature, but again, working with our students in the Public Service Center to take the Cornell students and to put them out in the world in service to the public and engaging their education in a way that will make them civically engaged adults and graduates of Cornell. Secondly, many of you may know this, some of you may not. The Carnegie Endowment has a classification system for publicly engaged universities. We made our application. They only accept applications once every 5 years, which caused us to inventory a wide range of public service activities on campus. And we were informed the 1st of January that Carnegie had recognized us as a publicly engaged university, a rigorous test of which we're quite proud. Third, we have engaged throughout this year, and a number of my colleagues are in the audience, but under the leadership of myself, Susan Murphy, our Vice President for Student and Academic Services, and Vice Provost for Undergrad Education, Laura Brown, engaged a committee of 7 faculty from 5 of the undergraduate colleges to think strategically and in a forward-looking way about service learning on the campus and its connection to curricula in the broadest possible sense. We hope to have a proposal for change by the end of this academic year, sometime in May or June, which we'll be presenting to the community for comment, discussion, and hopefully giving us first step to move forward towards change. This lecture is sponsored by an endowment, the Kaplan Family Endowment at the Public Service Center. This is one of 2 activities. In addition, we have Kaplan Family Faculty Fellows, which will be awarded later this evening. But the Kaplan family is not only a supporter, but an engaged supporter of our activities in this arena. It's been my pleasure and Susan's pleasure to interact with them, if only by phone, at least once a year, as we discuss service learning activities and the activities of the faculty on campus in making those awards. And I'd like to publicly acknowledge and thank all 3 of them. 3 of the 4 are here today: Leslie, Barbara, and Doug Kaplan, 3 members of the family. So thank you very much. This also happens to be an anniversary year. Their endowment was established in 2001, so it is the 10th annual lecture and the 10th set of Kaplan fellows that are being awarded. Now, this year we have the great pleasure of having as our lecturer one of Cornell's own, Jane Coyne. Now with, as my wife says, my French is too amateurish to say MSF, so Doctors Without Borders. Jane graduated from the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences in 1988. She then went on to graduate study at the Kellogg School at Northwestern University, earning an MBA. And after a corporate career of approximately 15 years, she took a distinct turn in her life, which I'm sure she'll talk about. In 2003, she chose to leave that corporate world and began working for Doctors Without Borders as a field logistician. Now, if you think about the list of countries that I'm just going to quickly read through. In 6 years, she had significant experiences in Uganda, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Sudan. In each case, often her work focused on logistics, that is, everything that Doctors Without Borders needs to operate. How do you get people, medicine, equipment on the ground in service to the needs of the people in those locations? After several years, 6 years exactly, of that fieldwork, Jane has been appointed a program manager and is based in Paris since July 2009, so the last couple of years. She leads the team in Paris that manages Doctors Without Borders operations now in South Sudan, Central African Republic, Kenya, and Georgia. And so please join me in giving a warm welcome to our own Jane Coyne.
So that's an auspicious start since the microphone has already fallen off. So thank you very much for the welcome. Indeed, I am Jane Coyne. I feel like you stole a lot of my thunder. I'm here to talk about myself, and that was an excellent summary. So I'm very happy to be here. Indeed, I did graduate almost 20 years ago, and it's been nice to be back on campus. So I thank the Kaplans for the opportunity to be here. And I actually am quite impressed to see the development of the Public Service Center, because that wasn't something that existed at Cornell when I was here. And so I think it's a neat opportunity for students on campus to be able to try to make some connections to public service opportunities. So I'm glad that it exists here, and I'm very happy to be here in support of it. So the first clue I think you've already had, MSF is the abbreviation of the French term Médecins Sans Frontières. So when I say MSF, I mean Doctors Without Borders, so lest there be any confusion. The way I've set up the presentation is I will spend about 5 minutes talking about Doctors Without Borders so that you can understand the organization and what I've gone to, and then I'm going to switch back and really talk about my life and my path to get there. So I suspect some of you will be interested in the path and some of you will be interested in Doctors Without Borders, but you're welcome to just ask questions at the end in terms of whatever is most interesting to you. So MSF, the first comment I have to say is MSF is a really big organization. So I looked at the numbers. MSF employs more people than our students in Cornell. So when you count the statistics at Cornell, I think it's over 21,000. We have now more than 23,000 staff in the field, in the world. When I say it's big, in 2010, we were nearly $1 billion organization. So that's $1 billion coming in and $1 billion going out. 85%, about 80% spent on program activities. And when you look at the funding, 85% of the funding comes from individuals, foundations, and corporations. So we have an exceptionally high ratio of funding that's independently sourced, which gives us a great deal of independence in the field and is really critical to us being able to do what we like to do. So the organization was founded, we're on our 40th anniversary, by a group of French doctors and journalists. And it was founded based on 3 fundamental principles. The first principle is neutrality. So neutrality pretty much means not taking a side in an armed conflict. But neutrality is absolutely critical for us to be able to convince people to give us access to regions and areas and patients. And it's also critical for the patients to be able to come and access us. The second principle is impartiality, so not that different than the amendment to our Constitution. Our goal is to be able to have all patients come into our structures, so no matter gender, race, ethnic group, religious orientation, and you actually have to do a fair amount to design your programs in order to be successful at that. So gender is the easiest one to explain. If you're building a hospital in Pakistan, you basically have to double your clinical staff because you need female doctors to see female patients and male doctors to see male patients. The third principle is independence. And so independence for us is the ability to assess and determine an intervention based on our view of medical needs, not based on someone else's statistics or someone else's agenda. And there are a lot of agendas out there, political, economic, military, whatever they are, but it's really, really critical to our mode of intervention to maintain that independence. So for me, these fancy words, like I like reading them, but it's really interesting to see how they carry out in a day-to-day operation. We're known for working in conflict areas, so while it is a true statement that 50% of our activities are in regions that you would call either conflict or politically unstable areas, the reality is that very few of our patients are actually gunshot wounds. So there's sort of this sexy trauma side, but that's a relatively small percentage of our operations. So the reality is conflict, the primary impact of conflict is displacement. And when a population moves, they're much more vulnerable. They're vulnerable, they need access to food, water, shelter, and obviously medical care. So MSF as an organization, we can do all of those things, but in general, we try to collaborate with other organizations. We focus on the medical care, and we'll let someone else work on water and sanitation, for example. Epidemics, so we're always on standby for outbreaks of diseases, measles, meningitis, cholera, et cetera. So it's definitely a part of our role. We are a medical organization. And I've learned a lot about diseases in the last 10 years. We obviously respond to natural disasters, and it's definitely the thing that hits the media, but when you look at as a percentage of our operations, only about 5% of our activities come from responding to natural disasters. And the way we respond is quite specific and different depending on the medical needs for the population that's affected and the capacity. So I can use two examples to illustrate this. One is in Haiti. So in Haiti, with the earthquake in January of 2010, 3 weeks after the earthquake, MSF provided 2/3 of the hospitalization beds in Port-au-Prince that were existing. So 1,800 out of 3,000 beds were run by MSF. So there was a tremendous amount of need in an area where we had the capacity to respond and very little capacity from the government or other structures on the ground. Whereas in Japan, we sent teams to do assessments and to evaluate the needs, and we have made a few very punctual interventions, but we have not set up a major operation in response to the tsunami and earthquake in Japan because the Japanese government has an immense emergency response capacity. So what do? We treat diseases, we treat patients, and that comes in many forms. So obviously we work on malnutrition. The UN estimates that there's 20 million children that suffer from severe acute malnutrition. And MSF plays a role both in treating those patients and in developing new products and therapeutic protocols to take care of the patients. So it's not just a therapeutic role. We do a lot of work in developing new protocols, new operational models to figure out how to treat more patients faster with less means for better results. So it's not a very technical term, but we make a distinction between what we call primary and secondary healthcare. So primary healthcare would be like a walk-in clinic here in the States. You can go in, you can have a medical consultation, you get a prescription, you get drugs. So primary healthcare can take many forms. We can work in an existing structure, or we can set up a clinic under a tree. So a mobile clinic is where you go. I never had the chance to go by boat, but I've spent a lot of long days in cars going to mobile clinics. So the basic diseases we treat are pretty much the same in all countries: diarrhea, respiratory infections, malaria, and we tend to focus on children, pediatric consultations, because in general, in terms of mortality, children are much more vulnerable than adults. So we work in secondary healthcare. So secondary healthcare is what we call hospitalization. And the hospitals take all different forms. So this is a picture from South Sudan. It's a pretty simple structure. It's very basic. But we have some very sophisticated structures as well. So before the earthquake in Haiti, we ran a trauma surgery program that was in a hospital that wouldn't look that different than Tompkins County here. In Amman, Jordan, we run a very specialized reconstructive surgery program, and I'm not sure there's many hospitals in the United States that look like that. So the design of the program is really based on the need, the population we're trying to reach, in the population we're trying to reach. Surgery, so in the last 10 years, MSF has really we've internally improved our capacity to do surgery. Because what we discovered is that while we had years and years of trauma surgery experience, the reality is, in terms of life-saving, the most important life-saving surgery that we do in our programs is cesarean sections, right? So when you cut the statistics up, the percentage of lives saved, cesarean sections, then other forms of visceral surgery for appendicitis or typhoid or something else. And then pretty far down the list is trauma. And so we had historically oriented our surgical capacity around trauma, and now surgery is really an integrated part of hospitalization. And vaccination. So MSF has grown enormously in the last 5 years. We have more money, we have more human resources, we have more technical capacity to draw from. But just to give you a sense of scale, in 2009, we vaccinated 8 million people against meningitis in the west of Africa, so Mali, Nigeria. It's not necessarily MSF's role to be doing this, but faced with an epidemic that is preventable, we're willing to step in. But we're now looking at vaccination in a different way and trying to figure out how we can work better with governments and the Ministry of Health and the World Health Organization to hold people accountable. In Malawi, we vaccinated 4 million kids against measles in a country that is stable and has a 90% coverage rate. So there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of preventing disease through vaccination, and my guess is that is a topic that will be coming up in the years to come. We also treat infectious diseases like HIV and tuberculosis. And again, MSF plays a role both in treatment as well as trying to push for better diagnostics and treatment therapies. So tuberculosis is a disease of increasing importance in the world these days. There's more and more cases. It's linked to the HIV epidemic. But the diagnostic tool we have is about 125 years old, and the antibiotics we're using were developed in the 50s. So we're now seeing resistance to tuberculosis, and MSF is helping to develop the protocols for drug-resistant tuberculosis. But we need new drugs and we need new tests. So MSF has this interesting perspective of trying to be neutral and independent, and yet being exceptionally political when we want something to happen. So we're pushing hard on drug development organizations and on governments to fund research in tuberculosis. So that was a brief overview on the medical side, but I, having started in the organization as a logistician, can't let you guys forget that, in fact, behind all of our medical activities, there's deep administrative organizations to manage the money and deep logistics capacity to be able to get the stuff where we need it, as was said in the introduction. And without that capacity, we don't do very much. So that is the very brief presentation on what MSF is doing. And I will switch now to talking about myself, which is a subject that I am far less comfortable with. So we'll see how it goes. So I grew up in Rochester, New York, not that far from here. I went to a small Catholic girls' school, and I came to Cornell and was relatively overwhelmed. So while I did graduate from the College of Ag and Life Sciences, I started in the College of Arts and Sciences as an econ major. My brother called me and said, "When are you going to become an engineer like the rest of us?" I took all the engineering core courses in the beginning of my sophomore year, and Physics 207 and I did not get along very well. And so then I decided I really wanted to be an architect, so I transferred to the architecture school, and by the beginning of my junior year, I decided that I really wanted to graduate. So I transferred to the College of Ag and Life Sciences, and I said to the Kaplans as we were walking over here, it was kind of an interesting and telling experience when I walked in, because it's the only place I've ever been, or it was the first place I'd been where I didn't have to spell my name. So there's a lot of Coynes that have graduated from the ag school, and there's a couple more in the audience. So I graduated, which my parents were very pleased with, and the only thing consistent in my Cornell life was that I sailed. So I sailed on the sailing team, which was not a varsity sport, it was a club sport, had been kicked off campus. And that became sort of my strongest interest, and it was really the core group of friends that I had at Cornell. And they were and are excellent friends and people. So I graduated, and fortunately I had some options, and that was grace of my roommate, Debbie Dory, who would sign me up for interviews that I didn't know about. Because she was determined to get a specific job, she would go and sign up for interviews and then sign me up for other things. So I did have a couple of choices, and of course I did not go to New York to be a banker or to work in insurance or to work for Saks Fifth Avenue. And instead, I took a job working for a sailmaker in Connecticut. And that job was perfect for me because I like making things, I like understanding how things fit together, and in fact, I was working in a tiny company, and I was production manager, and I got to see all the little pieces fit together. So then I left that job to go sailing, which my parents were even less thrilled with, and I went for 6 months sailing around the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, which was quite fabulous. But I came back and I was broke and I had no idea what I wanted to do. So I took the first job I was offered, and it was bad. We don't have to talk about that. And then I thought more about what I wanted, and I wanted to work in manufacturing or operations because I liked making stuff. And I wanted to work in a more professional environment. And I got a job actually through a tip from someone at a Cornell alumni. I got a job working for a consulting firm, a small firm that specialized in product development and operations consulting. And it was the perfect job for me. I was an analyst. I worked with really smart people. I learned a lot of things. And that is how I got to business school, which was never really my intention. So I did get a joint degree, a master's in manufacturing management, which had both the business side and the engineering side. And when I graduated, my father asked me if I took the lowest paying job I was offered again, and I said, no, not quite. But I went to work for HP, for Hewlett-Packard, and I took the job that was right for me. So that job was a project management job as a liaison between the business unit in California and the distribution centers in, or the factories and distribution centers in Asia. And that job was good. It lasted about 4 months, and I stayed at HP for about 3.5 years, but I managed to work in 3 different business units in 3 or 4 different countries. And I was always doing project management, setting up a distribution center, setting up a new production line, working on a new sales operations model. And it was at this point in my life, I believe, when my mother introduced me as her transient daughter, which, while accurate, I didn't think was very flattering representation of my life. And I left HP to go work for a startup. So 1999.com, I'm living in the Bay Area. I went to work for a startup. It lasted for all of 8 months. So up, down, very quick. That was good. I learned a lot. I had a lot more responsibility. I had people and budget and different responsibilities. That was good. But I decided I didn't really want a real job, and I managed to string together a series of consulting engagements. So I was working for myself and consulting mostly on the same kinds of projects I did in HP. So that goes on for about another 3 years. And then I decided to go work for MSF, and it was something that built. So in 2003, I made the commitment to go work for the organization, and I actually started in the field in 2004. And it is a combination of boredom. I had been doing the same thing for a while. I'd been living in the same city for a while. I went to see an amazing photography exhibit by Sebastião Salgado, which was about populations on the move. And it made me realize how many things had been happening in Africa that I didn't really know about. So I didn't know about the war in Angola. I didn't know about the Congolese War. I didn't know much about the genocide. And the combination of sort of the beauty of these images and my feeling that I'm a smart person and I read the newspaper and I didn't really know much was something that really started bugging me. I could have used the term public service. The term that was given to me really was from my parents was community responsibility. So when I graduated from Cornell, my parents actually sat me down and said, okay, you've got a lot of skills and you have a lot of opportunity. And some of that money is for you and some of it is for other people. And you need to figure out how to allocate your resources, and it's your choice, but very clearly said that there was a part of my benefits that were to be shared with other people. And my mother always did that in doing service work in the community. And I had on and off been volunteering for organizations. And so I came up with this concept that I would live my fancy life in San Francisco, but that I would go work for Doctors Without Borders for a year, and then I could come back and not be guilty, feel guilty. So that was part of it. And then the organization, so MSF, I actually started giving money to just after business school, and I had been learning about the organization, and I was really confident and comfortable with what the organization was doing and felt like it was a good cause. But more than that, I actually found a job I could do. So we basically have, 2/3 of the people, international staff in the field, are doctors or nurses or medical specialists. And 1/3 are either logisticians or administrators. And so I thought, oh, I've been on a boat. I can fix an engine. I know how to use a radio. It's going to be fine. I can be a logistician. And I managed to convince MSF of that, which is even more miraculous. And then finally, for me, the thing that sort of pushed me over the edge was the war in Iraq that I found inexplicable. And so I just felt like I needed to leave the country and do something different. So all of those things came together. I sent my application. MSF said yes. And then almost all choice goes away. So MSF pretty much just tells you where to go. So my first year, I worked in Uganda and in Sri Lanka, and they were incredible experiences to me. So in Uganda, I was helping to run a water system that provided water to about 30,000 people that had been displaced based on fighting in 2003. Oh, the date's wrong on that. So that is 2004. I'm wondering if I have an old version here. And then I went, so basically I was in the field for 7 months and I came back and I really felt like I had had this amazing experience, that I was pretty good at transferring my managerial skills into the field. I liked living in the middle of nowhere with no water, no cell phone, no electricity. That was all good for me. And I still felt good about the organization. And so I came back, I took a little break, and then the tsunami happened, and they called me and asked me to go to Sri Lanka, and it was not my best mission. So natural disasters are really complicated places to work. So I said that how we respond to natural disaster depends on the need and the capacity. There were no medical needs in Sri Lanka. People died. They didn't get injured. The hospitals were still functioning. Some were destroyed, but most were still functioning. And so MSF spent 4 months trying to figure out what we should do, and in the end, we left. So I think that going to investigate was the right decision, and I think leaving was the right decision. But it was insanely painful in the field because the people working in the teams always want to be doing something productive. We tend to be really, really hyper. And so I left the mission very, very frustrated, and somehow the only thing I managed to say when I got back to Paris was, if I'm going to work for MSF France, I need to learn French. And I was like, I literally didn't know where that came from. So I learned a little bit of French in our distribution center in Bordeaux. And then I had a couple of years of debate where I had said this was an experiment. I had said I was going back to California. And in fact, I kept saying yes to new missions. So what I saw in the missions in Nigeria and in the Central African Republic was really what MSF does best. So The nutrition emergency in the summer of 2005 was big. MSF treated, between Niger and Nigeria, 75,000 malnourished children, and our previous high was 20,000 in a year. And that's based on new products, so a new milk-based paste called Plumpy Nut, and new operational models, but everything was big. We had 12 tons of food distribution a day. We had cars running in a million directions. We were building buildings every 5 days. It was crazy, but it was really fun. So MSF, we have a problem, we have a medical solution, and we have a lot of means to make it happen. And for me, Central African Republic was the introduction to conflict. So I had never seen such fear in a population, and I had never seen MSF be able to respond in that kind of conflict setting. And it was powerful, both in terms of making me feel motivated to do what we were doing, as well as feeling confident that MSF was capable of handling high security, capable of working in an effective way in a high security context. So ultimately, at the end of 2006, I made my commitment to stay. I had decided that I was done with this debate and that this was the most interesting thing I could do, and I would continue to work with MSF for the future. And I had to let go of some of my financial concerns. I had to find out how to build relationships or maintain relationships with friends and family that were far away. Sorry. So I went to the Congo, and it seems very ironic in retrospect, but I asked for a 6-month mission, which is relatively long, in a French-speaking country so that I could learn French. So I spent 4 months in this utopia called Kaina, a beautiful hospital and nutrition project, learning French, very calm, everything is good, and then they asked me to be head of mission. So in our structure, you have a project that's managed by a project coordinator. So I was the field coordinator in Kaina, and I was very happy with my responsibility and comfortable with it. And the head of mission's job is to manage the coordination team. So a coordination team manages a country. So you have a doctor, a logistician, a finance person, and then the head of mission manages the team, but together we manage all the projects in the country. So I took over as head of mission, and just as background, the Congo basically has had 15 years of of conflict. The conflict goes up and down. So you could go to the east of Congo, to North Kivu, for 6 months and really never see any fighting. But as it happened in 2007, it was relatively calm for the first half of the year, and it got steadily worse from July until I left in January. And as head of mission, my responsibility is to manage the coordination team, and we manage the projects, but directly I'm responsible for security. So I am responsible for having the network of contacts, for having an analysis of the situation, and for deciding whether the teams can stay or need to be evacuated, or whether we can move on a road, or trying to resolve any conflict that we have or any challenges that we have to our security. So I'm going to just tell you one story because I think it illustrates some of the MSF principles quite well. So I've been in the country for about a year, and I've been head of mission for now 6 months, and I get a phone call, it was the 21st of November, 2007, from the logistician in our project in Rutshuru, which is a big hospital project. And of course, the field coordinator, the project manager, is out on vacation that week, so the logistician is doing the backup on security. And he calls me and he says, "Jane, it's urgent." I say, "Okay, I'm paying attention." And then he starts talking, and I was like, "Is that gunfire I hear?" He says, "Yes." And I say, "Okay, where are you?" He tells me he's in the hospital. So I say, "Okay, is anyone wounded? Is anyone injured? How is everyone?" He's like, "We're in the safe room, everyone's fine so far, but I haven't been able to contact everyone. And no, nobody armed has come into the compound." And I say, "Okay, that's good. So you go talk to the watchmen and tell them that in theory, we'd like all the armed guys to stay out, but they shouldn't do anything stupid like get shot, trying to keep people out. And why don't you call me back in 5 minutes with a list of where everyone is and how many people are accounted for." So at that point, we had a team of about 20 international staff, so that was not a small task. So I get off the phone and I call, and I make my first phone call to the head of the rebels, and I say, Colonel Wilson. And he answers the telephone and says, Jane, I'm a bit busy. And I was like, well, I'm fully aware of that. And he says, what can I do for you? And I say, well, and I'm furious. And so I say to him, I demand that you respect the neutrality of our hospital and that you respect the neutrality of the MSF teams in the field. And he says to me, Madame Jane, j'ai bien briefé, I well briefed my teams, and I told them that if anyone goes in the hospital or touches someone from MSF, I'll kill them. And I was like, whew, okay, that's not good, but it's not bad either. Better that way than the other. So I hang up with him, and I call the Army guy, and the Army guy says, I don't have any contact with the people. Do you have a real problem? And I was like, well, it's kind of a real problem. I was like, just make sure your guys stay out of the hospital. And he tells me I can't reach them. And I was like, whew, that's not so good. And I call the UN, and they're totally useless. So, so the point of the story is not like calling the guy to say, respect the team. The point of the story is that for at least 8 years, MSF has been working with all of these armed groups, and we know them, so I know who to call. And every time I meet with them, I say, or a new guy, I say, we're MSF, do you know MSF? This is what we're doing. Do you have a problem with it? Will you guarantee our security, based on the behavior of your men? And that is the relationship that you build up over time. It helps you do the analysis to decide when it's safe to move and when it's safe to stay. And it's what helps you be able to operate in those environments. So both neutrality and impartiality allowed us to stay in the Rutshuru Hospital when the front line was literally 3 miles. So it was not far, and there were several bad days, but no one was ever injured in our operations there. And this is one of the largest hospitals that MSF runs in terms of the number of patients, the number of surgical interventions, the number of births. So that's a little sojourn in Congo. So I'm in love with Congo. It shows. And Darfur, I'm not so in love with, but you will see why. So it's the only mission I ever chose. So I wanted to go to Darfur because the context was really interesting. I wanted to be head of mission because I had enjoyed, although I was very tired when I left the Congo, I had enjoyed that mission. And what I was confronted with as a new head of mission coming into Darfur in late 2008 is that the dilemmas we were facing were just enormous. And the most important of which was, what is the impact of MSF's operations there? And on the one hand, you have a massive displaced population. We still talk about 3 million people displaced in Darfur. But on the other hand, we had the lowest mortality I've ever seen in an MSF operation. I don't know why. No one can explain it, but they weren't very sick. So the pertinence of our medical activities was a legitimate question to ask. And in addition to that, it had waxed and waned over time, but our ability to access and assess the population in Darfur was almost zero. So the government didn't give us any permits to move. We couldn't get work permits for people to come into the country. And in terms of our operational flexibility, it was really almost zero. So I was on the verge of, making bold statements like MSF France should withdraw from Darfur, but that decision was taken out of my hands because MSF France and MSF Holland were expelled from Sudan when the International Criminal Court indicted President Bashir. So it was really a political statement. President Bashir kicked out 16 non-governmental organizations and said that we had violated the rules and laws governing humanitarian intervention. But he did it to American, British, and French organizations as a protest, really a protest against the Security Council and the International Criminal Court. So being the head of mission that was expelled from Sudan makes me slightly notorious in the organization. It was not that simple to get out of the country. It took about 6 weeks and $1 million to get the last people out of the country. And we're still working today to try and get MSF back into North Sudan. So MSF France back into North Sudan. So that leads us to my current job today. So I took a couple of months off, and I actually went to Paris to replace the guy who had been my boss when I was head of mission in Darfur. I went to replace him for a couple of months, but in fact, he quit when I arrived. And so I applied for the job as a permanent position, and I was accepted. So I talked a little bit about the structure. MSF has project managers, country coordination teams, and then above the coordination team, you have a desk that manages multiple countries. So I'm the program manager responsible for the desk for these countries. And I think it is pretty much the coolest job in the world, except that I have a lot of responsibility, and sometimes I get a little bit tired of that. So I tried to think for this presentation about what I've learned, and I'm not that reflective a person, I guess you would say. But there's a few things that are themes in my life. So I've had several phases, sort of the post-Cornell manufacturing, sailing phase, the post-Kellogg business corporate phase, and now this MSF phase. And I am not a planner. I am capable of creating opportunities, and I try to choose the most interesting opportunity. I'm curious, and I think that helps me generate opportunities because I tend to ask a lot of questions and take advantage of new things that are around me. I have a relatively high tolerance for instability, so it's not just with MSF that I've moved country to country. So remember, my mother called me transient already in 1999. I have a short attention span, which is entertaining to the Frenchies with whom I work because they can sit and discuss a subject for hours on end. And confidence is a really interesting thing. I would always have said that I have relatively low self-confidence, yet I seem to do things that require a certain amount of fortitude. And so I think for me, confidence doesn't come from any sort of inner fundamental characteristic. It's come from a series of experiences. So I don't think I could have done this job in my 20s, even though I would have more energy. I don't think I could have done it. So in a nutshell, I think that for me, my life is a series of opportunities, and I've developed some really broad skills, managerial skills, human skills, social skills, and I feel pretty lucky. So the answer to the question, what's next, is really, I don't know yet. I'm certainly not done. My job in Paris, I'll be there for at least another year or so. And I don't think I'm done with MSF, but I also think that there is a period of utter irresponsibility in my future, and I think that that will be perhaps in photography or perhaps a bartender, ski lift operator. Who knows? So that's my presentation for today. I'm sorry we've cut into the question and answer period, but I'm certainly happy to stay and answer any questions that people have. So, thanks.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Murphy, and Jane, thank you for that very fascinating discussion about MSF, as well as a particularly fascinating walk through life, or transient travels through life. We do have some time, and I'll be happy to make sure that people can hear what the questions, so let's take a few moments. Let me start at the back. John?
Jane, my name is John Weiss. I taught courses on Darfur here. As I listened to your account, I thought, well, you know, she's going to go two different directions. She's going to go to MSF in a higher managerial position, have more responsibility, or she may say, no, I want to get at the Darfur problem from the political end, and she's going to go political. She's going to be on the human rights side. She's going to advocate in Congress or with organizations like that. So what decided you to not go political, since people could argue that that's the real way to go?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question. Thanks so much. So I never took a history course in college. I never took a political science course. I didn't read very much. I was kind of a math science girl. And so this whole interest in politics and in how decision-making and power is shared is a new fascination for me. And I feel comfortable in the arenas where I work, so the places I know well, I feel comfortable in terms of having an opinion and positioning. But I also feel that, and it's part of my job, both in Paris today and as it was as a head of mission, I don't know, I think I fundamentally lack confidence in the ability to really influence change at a big level. And so taking that step into the arena is something that maybe will happen in the future, but I'm pretty pessimistic when I look at international bodies. So who would I lobby to? Do I lobby to the United Nations? For me, with all due respect to anyone who might be in the audience, I don't have any more confidence in the United Nations. Do I lobby to my government in the United States? So particularly on Darfur, the United States has a completely ambivalent position towards the government of Sudan and completely hypocritical position. I don't really have confidence in the institutions, so it's hard for me to make that leap, but you never know. Maybe one day.
Hey?
Thank you. When I saw the advertisement in the Cornell Daily Sun, I was excited to come and hear your talk. Although I must confess ignorance with Doctors Without Borders, but I thought, like with John, it was, right, John, is more political and taking more of a stand. And the reason I came to this talk is because it was about a year ago on the BBC News who first broke the story, and then other networks did. The BBC has been better at it than anybody else in terms of what's happening in the Congo. And I know Cornell University students, there was something in the Daily Sun. There's a group dealing with this too, which made me very proud, and I don't know exactly who's doing it, and I'd like to know at some point. Is that in the Congo, I mean, devastation because of all the different kind of mining that's been going on for years. But lately, the coltan, which is mined for cell phones and laptops and all the digital world we're in love with, is causing havoc for people there. I mean, women are being raped, which was a big issue being discussed on the news networks, but people are being killed. Children are being killed, displacement, natural areas being destroyed, habitat, animals. So I came actually to hear about that because I thought somebody working in the Congo might have more of an insight. I mean, if you're a doctor and you're aiding someone, I mean, you know, I would, you know, I think that the political somehow comes into play. But I do understand from what you said that you risk, you know, when you're there if you take sides. But somehow, I don't know, I just, I feel like somehow there needs to be more political, but on the other hand, if you have any experience to talk to that concern, I appreciate it.
So MSF has taken some strong political stands. So MSF withdrew from the Congo in 1995 when we felt that the aid camps, the camps that were set up for the refugees, the Rwandan refugees, were being massively manipulated and used to restructure the Hutu militia. So we felt that a big enough percentage of the aid being sent into to help the Rwandan refugees was being diverted to actually support the Hutu militias that we decided to withdraw. So there are moments in our history where we make strong political statements, and that is part of the core of the organization, but it's also exceptionally rare. So to talk more about the Congo, because I do love it, we talk often about the Congo. There's a whole series called Starved for Attention that was a huge media piece that MSF put together to try to increase exposure for the Congo, and it's on the website. You can find it pretty easily. But we tend to talk with a medical voice, and that credibility that you get talking from your medical experience is really how we frame most discussions. So just to sort of tee up in a general sense, the wars in Congo, so this is 97 to 2003, the estimated number of people killed in the Congo as a result of the conflict is 4.5 million people. It's huge. So, nope, I wasn't working there during that period. So it's important to remember that most of the people that died in that number died from either starvation or lack of access to health care. Very few of them are actually conflict-related deaths, but it's a direct result of the conflict that denied them access to their land or health care. When I was there in 2007, already rape had become a major, major issue in both North and South Kivu. MSF France alone treated 1,700 victims of rape in 2007. So we had 3 programs. We had hundreds of patients a month in our programs during the peak periods. It was astonishing to discuss with the local leadership the transformation of society when the local society had never experienced this level of sexual violence, and it became almost institutional. And when we looked at the patterns of violence, so we had ridiculous typology statistics. 85% of the rapists had a weapon at the time. 40% were multiple people involved. We had all those statistics. But how do you ensure that that patient can come for care? They have to come across the front line to get access to health care. And we made a choice, and we made a clear choice that we would privilege access over speaking out. And the only time I spoke publicly about rape I went on the record, I think it was with the New York Times, but I'm not sure, and basically just said 85% of the rapes were conducted by combatants. So I didn't even use the term military or militia. And it was combined with a report of Human Rights Watch that provided statistics about specific armed groups. And fortunately, the armed group that they really pissed off was, sorry about that, was a group called the CNDP that were extremely well organized. So the first message I got was, we're mad. The second message I got was, there might be an accident. My men are mad about what you said to the press, and someone might just shoot at your car. So it took a week to get out of that. So the practical aspect of ensuring both that patients can get to you and that you can continue to be safe is not that easy. So in 2007, 850,000 people were displaced. The total population of North Kivu is 4 million, so you take 800,000 over about half that population because it wasn't affecting the north of the territory. That's an astonishing number of people displaced. And it's a little bit misleading because those numbers, a lot of them were repeated. They were displaced in the beginning of the year, and then they went home, and then they were displaced again, or they were displaced from Sake to Mugunga, and then from Mugunga to Goma. So they didn't have to move once, they had to move twice. So I share your feelings that the violence in Congo is underreported. I really struggled with it, frankly, when I went to Darfur, because medically, the needs in Congo were much, much more important than what we were able to access in Darfur in 2008. So 2004 Darfur is not the same thing as 2008 Darfur. So that was a long answer, sorry.
Very, very interesting, though, a very current topic on this campus. Any other commentary or questions? Let me come over here. Right in the back. Please start with a strong voice. I'll come catch up with you.
Okay. Has MSF ever had to collaborate with the UN on a mission, or I don't know how often that happens, or how does that work?
So depending on how you define your word collaboration, we collaborate all the time. So the UN has a body called OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and we always coordinate with them, which is to say we tell them what we're doing, we help in developing a rational plan that not everybody's working in nutrition here and nobody's working in healthcare there. So we coordinate with them, and we are somewhat mercenary in using resources. So, for example, in South Sudan, if I wanted to have an MSF plane, it would cost me an extra $250,000 a year. So we use the UN planes in Congo. In Sudan. In the Central African Republic, we have our own plane for different reasons. We take other resources. So there's food resources that come from the World Food Program, therapeutic food that comes from UNICEF. So there is a bunch of coordination. The UN is a political body, and the UN allocates humanitarian resources based on political intentions, and there is no way you can get around that. So we have radically scaled back the amount of money that we take from the United Nations because we're unwilling to follow, in the spirit of our independence, to follow that line. So there is certainly coordination. There is a fair amount of coordination at the high level. So we do briefings in the UN on either medical topics or political topics when we see fit, but not a lot of collaboration necessarily on the ground.
Hi, my name's Uni, and I would like to thank you first for coming and talking to us. So actually, my question was, I actually took a course with Professor John Weiss last year, and we've learned that there are two aspects of humanitarian aid. There's the side where you help the ox get out of the hole when it falls into one, and there's also the side where you want to prevent the ox from falling into the hole in the first place by tying it up. So I was wondering what MSF was doing, if it was investing in any like preventative efforts, like such as maybe training the local doctors or raising awareness towards diseases.
That's a great question, and we define ourselves as a medical emergency humanitarian organization, and every one of those words can be challenged. What's medical, what's humanitarian, and what's an emergency? So with respect to that specific question, there are aspects of prevention that you see even in the slides that I presented, and it's becoming more and more of an issue. So I'll give you two examples. Malnutrition treatment. So at first, we developed all this capacity to treat more patients that were severely malnourished. But then, we started looking at, is there a better trade-off to prevent children with moderate malnutrition falling into severe malnutrition? And so we have actually been doing some work in that. In that role, MSF is trying new strategies to figure out how successful we can be in working on it. MSF will not implement that throughout the world, but we try to develop the protocol and the method and then sell it essentially to the UN and other organizations to get them to scale up operations. So on the nutrition side, that's a pretty good example. And on healthcare, vaccination is the real thing. It is just ridiculous how many times what percentage of our patients are preventable diseases. There's new vaccines against pneumococcal blah, blah, blah. So basically that help prevent respiratory infections. And everyone here in the United States gets that vaccine, but in Africa, nobody does. Whereas the kids are dying from pneumonia in Africa, but not very many kids die of pneumonia here in the United States. So there's a huge part of my job and my teams in the field's job to lobby the Ministry of Health to accept these new vaccines in their country. And MSF is putting more and more money and resources towards preventative or regular vaccination instead of going out and doing these massive campaigns. Vaccinating 10 million, 8 million people in West Africa costs millions and millions of dollars, whereas if you put that into a regular vaccination campaign, it's much, much less expensive. So there are parts of it, but in terms of developing human resources, most of that is sort of practical on-the-job training.
You gave the example of vaccinating against measles in Malawi and trying to hold that government accountable, given they have the capacity to do that. And I was wondering, how does MSF negotiate the tension between filling a gap and meeting a critical need, while also not wanting to perpetuate dependency of a government relying on external aid organizations to fill that gap in the long term?
So part of me wants to say, if I knew the answer to that, my job would be much easier. But the reality is we have learned a bunch of things over time. So today in Paris, we have 2 people dedicated to creating a dossier, a file, on vaccination, because we're tired of vaccinating in this emergency strategy. And so there's several examples. There's polio in the Republic of Congo. We had 1,000 people with polio in the Republic of Congo last year. It's ridiculous. Malawi, an outbreak of measles when you have 90% vaccination coverage, that's ridiculous. In Congo, we have measles every year, and the government won't let us vaccinate, and we fight every year about it. So we're trying to pull together a portfolio that's based on the emergency responses that we have that prove that the current strategies aren't working. And to try, and that will then go, you know, it'll go to the UN agencies, it'll go to the World Health Organization, it will go to the big money donors, so Gavi and Gates Foundation, and we'll go try to convince them based on our data, and then we'll go down to the government level, and then we'll, you know, keep saying the same thing in the field and hope it has some influence. But those kinds of decisions are really complicated, and it's really hard to stand back and not do something when you can see the medical need in front of you. At the field level, you just try to make the compromise, you know, to push the government to participate.
Well, Jane, thank you very much. When I think about one of our roles as having an opportunity to educate students who will become civically engaged, I can't think of a better example of what a Cornellian has become. You make us all very proud. I would say quite awed by what you do. So let me first, first say Barbara and Les and Doug, thank you for bringing this Cornell treasure home to us and allowing us to share her with the students and faculty and staff who are here. Really an inspirational afternoon. We do have a little gift for you, Jane, as a way of saying thank you. Of course, it's with a little red bag. It should be no surprise. And please join me in thanking Jane so much for a very interesting afternoon.